There comes a moment in life when you realize you've been living for everyone else but yourself. At 62, Cora Finch had that moment staring at a computer screen in a dim motel room, looking at a mountain farm being sold for $1. She'd spent 40 years working land that would never be hers, chasing a piece that always stayed just out of reach. This rundown Idaho property was her last chance at something real. The barn was falling apart, the tractor buried in weeds, but the land felt strangely familiar. Then she found the maps. Old ledgers hidden in the barn told a story about the previous owner who disappeared and something buried on the property worth $11 million. Now Cora had to decide, dig up the truth or walk away from the biggest discovery of her life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Cora Finch had learned early that roots were a luxury most people couldn't afford. Her grandfather had owned a small dairy farm in western Montana, and she'd spent summers there as a girl, helping him feed the cattle and mend fences. Those months had been the closest thing to home she'd ever known. When he died, the bank took the farm, and her mother moved them to Spokane, where work was steadier but life felt hollow. By 18, Cora was picking apples in Washington. By 25, she was managing harvest crews in California. She'd worked vineyards in Oregon, wheat fields in the Dakotas, and cattle ranches across Wyoming. 40 years of seasonal work had given her calloused hands, a strong back, and a weathered face that looked older than her years. It had also given her something most people never acquired, the ability to walk onto any piece of land and understand it. She could read soil composition by its color, predict water flow by the way grass grew, and sense a property's potential the way some people could sense a coming storm. The work had always been enough. She'd saved what she could, spent little, and asked for nothing. But lately something had shifted. Maybe it was turning 60, or maybe it was the way her knees ached in the morning. But Cora had started feeling the weight of all those years with nothing permanent to show for them. Every farm she'd worked had belonged to someone else. Every bunkhouse had been temporary. She'd been a ghost moving through other people's lives, essential but invisible. 3 months ago, she'd been managing a vineyard outside of Portland for a man named Vernon Hayes. The pay was decent, the work familiar, and she'd thought maybe she'd stay through the winter. But Vernon's son had come home from business school with ideas about efficiency and profit margins. He'd looked at Cora the way you look at old equipment, functional but outdated, something to be replaced with newer models. She'd left before he could fire her, taking her last paycheck and a sense of finality she couldn't quite name. She'd been staying at a motel in Hood River, trying to decide what came next, when she stumbled across the listing. It was late at night, and she'd been scrolling through rural property sites the way some people scrolled through old photographs, nostalgic and pointless. Then she saw it. Mountain Farm, Idaho backcountry, $1 as is. The posting included 3 grainy photographs showing a sagging barn, an overgrown field, and a small farmhouse with a collapsing porch. The description was minimal. 160 acres, remote location, no utilities, buyer responsible for all repairs and back taxes. Most people would have kept scrolling. But Cora had stared at that screen for 20 minutes, something pulling at her chest. The property looked familiar in a way she couldn't explain. The mountains in the background reminded her of her grandfather's place. The barn had the same lean. Even the way the trees clustered at the property's edge felt like something she'd seen before. She'd made the offer at 2 in the morning, typing out a simple email stating she'd pay the dollar asking price and handle all associated costs. The response came 8 hours later from a law firm in Boise. The property was hers if she could wire $5,000 for back taxes and closing costs by end of business Friday. She'd done it without hesitation, draining most of her savings account and feeling simultaneously reckless and certain. The paperwork arrived by courier 3 days later. The deed listed the property as the old Hadley place, 160 acres in Lemhi County, accessible via Forest Service Road 12 miles outside the town of Pine Haven. The previous owner, Thomas Hadley, had purchased it in 1997 and paid taxes faithfully until 2018 when payments stopped. The county had eventually seized it for back taxes and listed it for minimal sale just to clear the books. Cora had packed everything she owned into her weathered rucksack and the bed of her ancient Toyota pickup. 40 years of living had taught her to travel light. 3 changes of clothes, a sleeping bag, basic tools, a camp stove, and a box of books her grandfather had given her. That was the sum of her possessions. She'd driven east out of Oregon on a Wednesday morning in early September, watching the landscape shift from green valleys to high desert to mountain forest. The drive to Pine Haven took most of the day. The town was smaller than she'd expected. Maybe 800 people, a main street with a grocery store, a diner, a post office, and a gas station. She'd stopped for supplies, loading up on canned goods, rice, batteries, and lamp oil. The woman at the register had looked at her purchases and asked if she was camping. Cora had said something vague about staying at a property outside town. The woman had nodded but didn't ask which one. The Forest Service Road started 2 miles north of town, marked by a faded wooden sign. It was dirt and gravel, rutted from spring runoff, and narrow enough that she had to fold in her mirrors. The Toyota climbed steadily, pine trees pressing close on both sides, the afternoon light filtering through branches in scattered gold. After 8 miles, she passed a mailbox with Drummond painted on the side. After 10 miles, there was nothing but forest. At mile 12, she found the turnoff. 2 wooden posts marked what had once been a driveway, now nearly overgrown with brush. She turned in carefully, branches scraping the truck's sides, and followed the rutted path for another half-mile before the trees opened up and she saw the property. The photographs hadn't done it justice. The farmhouse was small and weathered, its paint long gone, and its porch sagging dangerously. But the bones looked solid. Log construction, probably built in the 1940s or 50s. The barn was larger than expected, listing to one side but still standing. Beyond them, the land rolled gently upward toward a tree line, and beyond that, mountains rose in layers of blue and grey. The late afternoon sun painted everything in amber light. Cora had sat in her truck for a long time, engine ticking as it cooled, just looking. The property felt alive in a way that was hard to articulate. Wind moved through the tall grass with a sound like breathing. Birds called from the tree line. Somewhere distant water was running, a creek or spring she hadn't seen yet. And underneath it all was that strange sense of familiarity, as if she'd been here before in another life. She'd finally climbed out, grabbed her rucksack, and walked to the farmhouse. The front door was unlocked, hanging slightly crooked on old hinges. Inside, dust lay thick over everything. The main room held a wood stove, a table, 2 chairs, and a narrow cot against one wall. A doorway led to a smaller back room that might have been a bedroom. No electricity, no running water, but the structure was sound. The roof had held. The windows, though filthy, were intact. That first night, she'd spread her sleeping bag on the cot, lit a kerosene lamp she'd brought, and sat at the table eating cold beans from a can. The silence was profound. No traffic sounds, no voices, no hum of machinery. Just wind and the settling sounds of an old house. She'd felt something loosen in her chest, something that had been tight for longer than she could remember. She'd slept deeply and woken to pale light filtering through dirty windows. Dawn came slowly to the mountains, building in layers. Cora had made coffee on her camp stove and carried it outside, walking the property as the sun climbed. The barn was even more decrepit up close, roof partially collapsed, doors hanging loose, floor rotted in places. But it had good bones too. With work, it could be salvaged. She'd been examining the barn's foundation when she heard a vehicle coming up the driveway. A battered white sedan appeared, kicking up dust, and stopped near her truck. A man climbed out, older, wearing a postal service uniform. He'd raised a hand in greeting and walked over carrying a handful of mail. "You must be the new owner," he'd said, extending the letters. "Cora Finch, right? I'm Del Patterson. Run the mail route out here." "That's me," she'd said, taking the mail. It was mostly junk addressed to current resident. Dell had looked around the property with the expression of someone remembering better days. Haven't been up here since old Tom Hadley disappeared. Must be 7 years now. Place has gone to seed, but it's good land. Your taxes are paid up? Just cleared them. Good, good. He'd paused, seeming to weigh his words. Tom was a good man. Kept to himself mostly, but always had time for a conversation when I stopped by. Smart fellow. Geologist or something like that. Then one day he was just gone. Sheriff looked into it, but never found anything. Truck was still here, personal effects, everything. Like he vanished into thin air. Cora had felt a small chill, despite the warming morning. Anyone know what happened? Dale had shrugged. Lots of theories, no answers. Some folks think he got lost hiking and the mountain took him. Others say he had debts or troubles he walked away from. I figure a man's got his reasons for his choices. Still, it's a strange story. They'd talked a few more minutes about mail delivery and the best route to town before Dell had climbed back in his car. As he'd turned to leave, he'd called through his window, "Property's got a strange history, Miss Finch, but maybe that's what makes it interesting. You need anything, Pinehaven's got most everything." She'd watched him disappear down the driveway, those words hanging in the air. Strange history. She'd felt it the moment she arrived, that sense of something unfinished, something waiting. But instead of unsettling her, it had felt like an invitation. Walking back to the farmhouse, Cora had noticed the way the morning light hit the mountains, the way shadows moved across the land. This place had chosen her as much as she'd chosen it. And whatever secrets it held, whatever had happened to Thomas Hadley, she had time now to understand. For the first time in 40 years, she had all the time in the world. By her third day on the property, Cora had established a routine. Rise at dawn, make coffee, walk the land to understand its rhythms. The mornings were cool enough that she could see her breath, but by midday, the September sun still had heat. She'd spent the first 2 days clearing brush from around the farmhouse and assessing what could be salvaged. The well still worked. She'd tested it and found the water cold and clear. The outhouse was serviceable. These small victories felt like progress. The barn demanded attention. It was the largest structure on the property and seemed to hold stories in its weathered boards and shadows. Wednesday morning, Cora had decided to start sorting through its contents. She'd put on her work gloves, grabbed a flashlight and pushed through the sagging doors. Inside, the barn was larger than it appeared from outside. Shafts of sunlight pierced through gaps in the roof, illuminating dust motes that swirled with her movement. The floor was dangerous in places. Rotted boards covered holes that dropped into darkness. Old farm equipment lay scattered and rusting. A defunct tractor, tangles of chain, tools she couldn't identify. Hay bales, ancient and decomposed, were stacked against the far wall. She'd been working methodically, moving smaller items into piles, salvageable, scrap, uncertain, when she noticed something odd about the hay bales. They were stacked tightly, but behind them the wall didn't quite line up. There was a gap, a shadow that suggested space beyond. Cora had pulled on the nearest bale. It was lighter than expected, mostly dust held together by twine. She'd moved 3 more, coughing from the debris, and found what the stack had been concealing. A ladder built into the wall, leading up to a loft that wasn't visible from below. The entrance had been deliberately hidden. Her pulse had quickened. She'd tested the ladder carefully, putting weight on each rung before committing. The wood held. She'd climbed slowly, flashlight clenched between her teeth until her head cleared the loft floor. The space was small, maybe 10 feet by 12, and the roof here was intact. Someone had used this as a workspace or storage. A wooden trunk sat against the far wall. Beside it, a folding chair and a small table. Papers were scattered across the table's surface, weighted down by rocks. The air smelled of old wood and something else, leather and metal. Cora had hauled herself up into the loft and approached the trunk. It was made of cedar, old but well-maintained, with brass corners and a simple latch. She'd opened it carefully, half expecting it to be empty or full of meaningless junk. Instead, she'd found surveying equipment. A theodolite, carefully wrapped in cloth, measuring chains, a plumb bob, and sitting on top of everything else, catching the light, a brass compass. It was beautiful, hand-engraved, the kind of instrument someone had cared for. She lifted it carefully and turned it over. Initials were etched into the base, T.H., and beneath them a date, 1952, Thomas Hadley. But 1952 would have been decades before he owned this property. An inheritance, perhaps, or something he'd found. She'd set the compass aside and examined the papers on the table. They were hand-drawn maps, detailed property surveys showing the land from multiple angles. Some were clearly official, with precise measurements and dated signatures. Others were rougher, sketched quickly with handwritten notes in the margins. Several showed marked zones, small X's scattered across the property with coordinates written beside them. In one corner, almost as an afterthought, someone had written, "Primary location, verify depth soundings." Cora had sat in the folding chair, spreading the maps before her, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The coordinates meant nothing to her yet, but the care taken in documenting them suggested importance. And that compass, why would someone hide surveying equipment in a barn loft? She'd been so absorbed in the maps that she hadn't heard the vehicle approach. It was only when footsteps sounded on the barn floor below that she'd realized she wasn't alone. "Hello?" A woman's voice, cautious but not unfriendly. "Anyone here?" Cora had quickly gathered the maps and compass, tucking them back in the trunk, then climbed down the ladder. At the bottom stood a woman in her 60s, holding a covered dish and looking mildly embarrassed. "Goodness, you startled me," the woman had said, pressing a hand to her chest. "I'm Faye Drummond. I live down the mountain a ways. Saw smoke from your chimney and thought I'd bring by some welcome food. Didn't mean to intrude." Cora Finch. She'd brushed dust from her jeans and extended a hand. "Not intruding at all. I appreciate the kindness." Faye had studied her with intelligent eyes, taking in the work clothes and the comfortable way Cora moved through the space. "You're actually planning to stay then?" "Lot of folks thought whoever bought this place would flip it or abandon it. I'm staying." They'd walked back to the farmhouse, Faye chatting about the weather and the difficulty of the access road in winter. But Cora had sensed something underneath the pleasantries, a tension, maybe wariness. Inside, Faye had set the dish on the table. It was still warm, chicken casserole with biscuits on top. "That's very kind of you," Cora had said. Faye had waved it off, but her expression had grown serious. "I knew Tom Hadley. Not well, but we were neighbors for almost 20 years. He was a private man, but decent. Good neighbor. Del Patterson mentioned he disappeared 7 years ago this October." Faye had moved to the window, looking out at the property. "Sheriff investigated, called it an accident or a voluntary disappearance. But Tom wasn't the kind of man to just walk away. He loved this land. Talked about it like it was a living thing." There had been a long pause. Finally, Faye had turned back to Cora, her voice dropping. "If you find anything here, anything at all that seems unusual, you might want to think carefully about what you do with it. This property has drawn interest over the years. The kind of interest that makes people uncomfortable." "What kind of interest?" "The corporate kind. Surveys, assessments, offers to buy." Tom turned them all down flat. After he disappeared, those inquiries stopped. She'd picked up her empty dish, preparing to leave. "I'm probably speaking out of turn, but you seem like good people, and I'd hate to see trouble come to this place again." Cora had walked her to the car, thanking her for the food and the warning, because that's what it had been, thinly veiled. After Faye drove away, she'd stood in the yard for a long time, looking at the barn and the mountains beyond. Back in the loft, she'd retrieved the brass compass and the maps, spreading them across her farmhouse table. The coordinates were specific. The maps showed locations across the property that meant something to Thomas Hadley. And now someone was warning her about corporate interest, about leaving certain things alone. She turned the compass over in her hands, feeling its weight. The needle swung true north, steady and certain. 1952, that date nagged at her. This compass had been important long before Hadley owned this land. As evening shadows lengthened across the mountains, Cora had made a decision. Tomorrow at first light, she would follow those coordinates. Whatever Thomas Hadley had been looking for, whatever had drawn corporate interest to this remote piece of land, she was going to find it. Not because she was greedy or foolish, but because this was her property now, her land, her responsibility, and because something in her, gut honed by 40 years of reading land and weather and people, told her that understanding this mystery was the only way she'd ever truly be safe here. She'd eaten Faye's casserole as darkness fell, the brass compass sitting beside her plate, its needle pointing steadily towards something she couldn't yet see, but knew was waiting. Dawn came cold and clear. Cora had woken before sunrise, made strong coffee, and studied the maps by lamplight. The first coordinate set was marked with particular emphasis, circled twice, and annotated with primary marker limestone outcrop. She'd plotted it on a topographic map of the property she'd found in the glove box of her truck, determining it was roughly 3/4 of a mile northeast. Up into the forested slope, she'd dressed in layers, filled a canteen, and packed a small rucksack with supplies, the compass, the maps, a knife, rope, matches, and a notebook. By the time she set out, the sun was just breaking over the eastern ridge, painting the mountains in shades of rose and gold. The terrain grew steeper as she climbed. Pine forest gave way to older growth, massive, Douglas firs and western hemlocks that blocked out much of the sky. The ground was thick with moss and fallen needles that muffled her footsteps. She'd walked for 40 minutes, checking the compass regularly, adjusting her path to match the coordinates. She'd found the marker almost by accident. It was smaller than expected, a brass survey pin driven into a limestone outcropping, nearly hidden by moss. She'd knelt beside it, brushing away the growth, and found numbers etched into the metal, the same coordinates from Hadley's map. But what caught her attention was the hollow tree 10 feet away. The trunk was massive, a cedar that must have been 300 years old, dead now, but still standing. At chest height, a section of bark had fallen away, revealing a cavity inside. Cora had approached carefully and shone her flashlight into the opening. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a leather-bound journal. Her hands had trembled slightly as she'd pulled it free. The oilcloth had done its job. The journal was dry and intact. She'd sat on the limestone outcrop and opened it carefully. The first page bore a name and date, Thomas Hadley, January 1998. The entries began simply enough. Hadley had documented his purchase of the property, his reasons for choosing this specific location. Remote enough for privacy, he'd written, but with geological features that warrant serious study. He described himself as a retired geologist, formerly with the U.S. Geological Survey, drawn to Idaho by anomalous data he'd encountered in archived reports. Cora had flipped through the pages, reading entries that spanned 20 years. Hadley's early excitement was palpable. He'd conducted surveys, taken samples, mapped underground water flows. By March 1998, he'd written, "Initial findings confirm my hypothesis. Limestone karst topography with extensive cavity structures beneath the surface. But the mineral composition is unusual. Traces of rare earth elements at concentrations that shouldn't exist naturally at this elevation." The journal entries grew more technical. Hadley documented tests, measurements, theories. He'd sent samples to university labs using false names, never revealing the source location. Results had come back confirming his suspicions. The land contained deposits of neodymium, dysprosium and terbium, rare earth elements essential for modern electronics, defense systems and renewable energy technology. By 2005, Hadley had written, "Conservative estimates suggest deposits worth at minimum $8 million, possibly significantly more. But extraction would require major infrastructure. More importantly, I'm now certain these deposits are connected to the 1940s mining operation." Found references in county archives to Cascade Minerals Corporation. They abandoned this site abruptly in 1953, citing unfavorable conditions, but that makes no sense given the geological data. Men don't walk away from fortunes unless forced. Later entries revealed Hadley's growing paranoia. In 2012, Third inquiry this month from development companies. How do they know? I've been careful. Someone is monitoring property transfers, looking for specific geological markers. Need to be more cautious about who I trust. 2016. Direct approach today from Vanguard Resource Solutions. Man named Kemp, slick suit, harder questions. Offered 200,000 cash for immediate sale. When I declined, he suggested I consider carefully, given my situation. What situation? This is intimidation, pure and simple. I've documented everything and stored copies off-site. If anything happens to me, there's a trail. The final entry was dated September 2018. Pressure has become unbearable. Surveying equipment tampered with. Mail opened and resealed. Last week, someone cut my brake lines. I only discovered it by chance. I can't involve the authorities. Too much evidence they're compromised. Have decided on a course of action that will protect the discovery and potentially expose Vanguard's activities. This journal and all documentation will be hidden on the property. When the time is right, I'll resurface. But for now, Thomas Hadley needs to disappear. Cora had sat in the forest for a long time after reading those words, the morning birds calling above her, sunlight filtering through branches. Hadley hadn't died or walked away. He'd faked his disappearance to escape corporate pressure and protect what he'd found. And now she was sitting here, holding his journal. With that same pressure surely about to redirect toward her, she'd hiked back to the farmhouse with the journal tucked safely in her pack, her mind working through implications. If Hadley had been right about the deposits, this property was worth far more than $11 million. And if Vanguard Resource Solutions had been willing to intimidate and threaten to acquire it, they wouldn't stop just because ownership had changed. Back home, she'd made lunch and read through the journal again, more carefully this time, taking notes. Hadley had been methodical about documentation. He referenced additional materials, survey reports, assay results, correspondence with Vanguard, all of it hidden somewhere on the property. She'd been deep in thought when the phone rang, the old landline that came with the property, which she'd been surprised to find still connected. She'd answered cautiously. "Miss Finch?" A man's voice, professionally pleasant. "This is Robert Chen from the Lemhi County Assessor's Office. I'm calling to verify some information about your recent property acquisition." "What kind of information?" "Just routine verification, making sure our records are accurate." A pause. "We've had some inquiries about the property recently. Potential easement issues, utility access considerations. I wanted to confirm you're the sole owner and have no plans for immediate development or resale." The questions felt wrong, too specific, too interested. "Who's been making inquiries, Mr. Chen?" "Oh, just general interest. County planning department, that sort of thing." His tone had remained light, but Cora had heard the evasion. "If you're planning any development work, you'll need to file environmental impact assessments, which can take considerable time. Just want to make sure you're aware of the regulatory landscape." "I'm aware." "Thank you for calling." She'd hung up, feeling unsettled. Within days of taking ownership, people were already circling. The county assessor calling about inquiries, phase warnings about corporate interest. It all confirmed what Hadley's journal had documented. That afternoon, she'd driven into Pine Haven, parking outside the small public library. The building was old but well-maintained, smelling of books and furniture polish. A young librarian had directed her to the local history section, where archived newspapers and county records were kept on microfilm. She'd spent 3 hours searching, making notes, printing relevant pages. The Cascade Minerals Corporation had indeed operated in the area during the 1940s. They'd filed multiple mining claims in 1947, employing up to 50 men. Local newspapers from that era carried stories about the boom, new jobs, economic hope for a struggling post-war community. Then, in March 1953, a brief article, "Cascade Minerals Ceases Operations." The company had shut down with minimal explanation, laid off all workers, and transferred their claim holdings to private ownership under circumstances the article described as unclear. No details about what they'd been mining or why they'd stopped. The property that became Hadley's farm had been part of that original claim. It had passed through several owners over the decades, always sold quickly, never developed, until Hadley bought it in 1997 and started asking the right questions. Cora had left the library with a folder full of copies, and a growing certainty that she was stepping into something much larger than a simple property purchase. Hadley had spent 20 years documenting a mystery that had started 70 years ago, and somewhere on her land, buried beneath limestone and forest, was something valuable enough that people had been willing to commit crimes to possess it. Driving back up the mountain as sunset approached, she'd made her decision. She wouldn't be intimidated, and she wouldn't walk away. But she also wouldn't be reckless. Whatever came next, she needed to be smart, careful, and prepared. Thomas Hadley had learned that lesson too late. She wouldn't make the same mistake, and jeans, a pressed shirt, her good boots, wanting to look like someone who belonged, someone with a legitimate business. The records office was in the basement, fluorescent lit and smelling of old paper. A clerk in his 20s barely looked up from his computer as she signed in and requested access to historical mining claims and property transfers for her specific parcel. The files came in bankers' boxes, chronologically organized but dense with legal language and technical specifications. Cora had spread them across a research table and begun working through them systematically, taking photographs with her phone when copying wasn't allowed. The 1947 mining claim, filed by Cascade Minerals Corporation, was extensive, 40 pages of geological surveys, assay reports and legal declarations. The company had identified significant mineral deposits across a 3-square-mile area, with the richest concentration on what was now her property. They'd invested heavily, drilling equipment, housing for workers, processing facilities, but it was the 1953 documents that proved most interesting. The claim abandonment paperwork was perfunctory, citing only unfavorable economic conditions, yet attached to it was something unusual, a legal declaration signed by a federal surveyor, stating that certain findings from the site were classified under national security protocols and would be sealed for 50 years. 50 years from 1953 meant those records should have been unsealed in 2003. Cora had requested those files specifically. The clerk had disappeared into the archives and returned 20 minutes later with a thin folder marked Cascade Minerals, declassified 2003. Inside were 3 documents. The first was a Department of Defense memo dated February 1953, stating that mineral samples from the Cascade operation contained strategic materials of national interest and recommending the site be secured under federal oversight. The second was a property transfer deed, signed with multiple government agency stamps, transferring the land from Cascade to a private individual, someone named Albert Marsh. The third document was a handwritten letter from Albert Marsh to his son, dated 1967. William, when I'm gone, this land will be yours. I've kept faith with the promise I made in 1953. The government men said certain things needed to stay buried, needed to stay secret. I've honored that, but times change. If you ever decide to look, you'll find what they were so worried about. It's there waiting. Just be careful who you trust. Cora had photographed every page, her hands steady despite the adrenaline. Albert Marsh. She'd seen that name in property records. He'd owned the land from 1953 until his death in 1985. Then it had passed to William Marsh, who'd sold it to Thomas Hadley in 1997. She'd closed the files and returned them to the clerk, then asked a casual question: "Is there a William Marsh still living in the area?" The young clerk had shrugged. "Not that I know of, but you could ask Bill Marsh. He's been county clerk forever, knows everybody. Usually has lunch at the diner on Main Street around noon." Cora had found him there an hour later, a man in his 70s, thin and weathered, eating a bowl of soup alone at the counter. She'd introduced herself as the new owner of the old Hadley place and asked if she could join him. He gestured to the stool beside him with the easy courtesy of someone who'd spent his life in small towns where strangers were rare. "You're brave, taking on that property. he'd said, after they'd talked pleasantries about weather and road conditions. "It's beautiful land, but it's got a complicated history. I'm starting to learn that. Found some interesting documents at the courthouse this morning. Cascade Minerals, 1940s mining operations." Bill had set down his spoon and looked at her more carefully. "Most people don't dig that deep into the history. I like to know what I'm dealing with." "Found a letter from Albert Marsh to his son William. I take it you're related?" A long pause. Finally, he'd nodded. "William was my father. Albert was my grandfather. The land you're living on was in our family for 32 years before my father sold it to Tom Hadley." "Why did he sell?" Bill had pushed his bowl away, appetite apparently gone. "My father was a private man. He'd inherited the property expecting to build a life there, but he never felt right about it. Said the land had secrets that weighed on him. In 1997, Tom Hadley made him an offer. Not much money, but my father took it. Said Tom was the kind of man who'd know what to do with what was there." What was there? Bill had looked around the diner, checking who might be listening. The place was nearly empty, just them and a waitress refilling coffee 2 booths away. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. "My grandfather worked for Cascade Minerals in the early 50s. Just labor at first, but he was smart and they promoted him to surveyor. That's how he saw what they found. The rare earth deposits were real, valuable even then. But there was something else, something in the deep caverns that the geologists couldn't explain. My grandfather never told me exactly what, but whatever it was, the government got involved. They shut everything down, classified the findings, and paid my grandfather to take ownership and keep quiet." "Did he keep quiet?" "For 40 years. But before he died, he told my father the truth. Said it was too important to stay buried forever. My father lived with that knowledge his whole life, never quite knowing what to do with it. When Tom Hadley came around asking geological questions, my father saw an opportunity. Sold him the land cheap, told him just enough to point him in the right direction. Cora had absorbed this carefully. And Tom disappeared 7 years ago." "He did." Bill's expression had darkened. 3 months before he vanished, he came to see me. Brought documents, photographs, evidence of corporate harassment. Asked me to keep them safe. Said if anything happened to him, I should give them to someone trustworthy. Someone who'd know what to do with them. "Did you keep them?" "I did. Still have them locked in my home safe." They'd looked at each other across the diner counter, an understanding passing between them. Bill saw in her what his father had seen in Hadley. Someone capable of carrying the burden, someone who wouldn't be easily intimidated or bought. "The company that pressured Tom," Cora had said quietly. "Vanguard Resource Solutions. Are they still active in the area?" "More than ever. They've bought up mineral rights all over the county, but they've never been able to get that one piece they really want, your land. The piece with the real value." He'd pulled out his wallet, extracted a business card, and slid it across the counter. His home address was written on the back. "Come by tomorrow evening. I'll show you what Tom left with me. But Miss Finch, understand that once you see it, you'll be committed. There's no going back to not knowing." She'd taken the card, feeling the weight of it. "I think I'm already committed." That afternoon, returning to her property, Cora had found her truck parked exactly where she'd left it, but something was wrong. All 4 tires had been slashed, clean cuts, deliberate and thorough. No note, no message, just damage, designed to strand her and send a message. She'd stood looking at the ruined tires for a long moment, anger building. This was the same tactic they'd used on Hadley. Intimidation, escalation, making life difficult until you gave up and sold. But Cora had spent 40 years dealing with difficult men on difficult land. She knew how to be stubborn. She'd hiked back down to the main road, flagged down a passing rancher, and gotten a ride into Pinehaven. At the gas station, she'd arranged for a tow and new tires, expensive, eating into her limited savings, but necessary. While waiting, she'd called the sheriff's office and filed a report, knowing it probably wouldn't matter but wanting documentation. A deputy had come out, looked at the tires, taken photographs and a statement. He'd been polite but disinterested, suggesting it was probably kids or hunters who'd mistaken the property for abandoned. Cora hadn't argued. She'd learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting directly. By the time she'd gotten back to the farmhouse with functioning tires, evening was settling over the mountains. She'd made dinner, then sat at the table with Hadley's journal and the documents she'd photographed at the courthouse, arranging them chronologically, building a timeline. 7. Cascade Minerals discovers valuable deposits and something unusual in deep caverns. 53. Federal government classifies findings, shuts down operation, transfers land to Albert Marsh as caretaker. 85. Albert dies. Land passes to William Marsh, who lives with the secret uncomfortably. 97. William sells to Thomas Hadley, who begins systematic investigation. T18. After years of corporate pressure, Hadley disappears. 225. Cora buys the property for $1. She'd sat back, looking at the pattern. Each owner had carried the burden differently. Albert had kept silent. William had passed it on. Hadley had tried to expose it and been forced into hiding. Now it was her turn, and she needed to decide what to do with knowledge that others had killed to suppress. The slashed tires had been a warning, but warnings only worked on people who could be scared. And Cora Finch, at 62, had learned that the only thing more dangerous than having something to lose was having nothing left to lose. She'd spent 40 years owning nothing, belonging nowhere. This land was hers. Whatever was buried here, whatever secret had haunted 3 generations, she would uncover it. Not for money, though that mattered, but for the simple, stubborn reason that it was hers to know. Tomorrow she'd visit Bill Marsh and see what Hadley had left behind. Tonight, she'd sleep with her grandfather's old hunting rifle beside the bed and her ears tuned to any sound that didn't belong to the mountain night. She wasn't afraid. She was prepared. There was a difference, and it mattered. The drive to Boise took most of the following morning. Cora had decided she needed proper equipment before exploring any caves or underground chambers. Hadley's journal had described extensive cavern systems, and she wasn't fool enough to go unprepared. The outdoor supply store was staffed by young people who looked at her with barely concealed skepticism when she asked about spelunking gear. But she knew what she needed. A reliable headlamp with backup batteries, rope rated for climbing, carabiners, a harness, a helmet, emergency flares, and a first aid kit. She'd added a better camera and a handheld GPS unit. The total had made her wince, but she'd paid cash and left with everything loaded in her truck. On the drive back, she'd stopped at Bill Marsh's house in Salmon as planned. He lived in a modest ranch home on a quiet street, the kind of place that spoke of careful maintenance and limited means. He'd been waiting for her, opening the door before she could knock. Inside, his home was neat and spare. Photographs of family lined the walls, children, grandchildren, a wife who'd passed based on the dates beneath her portrait. Bill had led her to a small office and closed the door behind them. From his desk safe, he'd removed a large manila envelope worn from handling. Tom gave me this in July 2018. Said if he disappeared or died, I should give it to whoever bought the property next, assuming that person seemed trustworthy. Cora had taken the envelope and opened it carefully. Inside were dozens of documents, official geological surveys, laboratory assay reports, photographs of rock formations and cave systems, correspondence on Vanguard Resources letterhead. The assay reports alone were stunning. They confirmed deposits of neodymium, terbium and dysprosium at concentrations that were commercially viable. Conservative estimates placed the total value at $11 million, but it was the photographs that captured her attention. They showed underground chambers of extraordinary size, limestone formations millions of years old, and in several images, something else, crystalline structures that didn't look natural. The formations were too regular, too geometric. Tom believed these weren't entirely natural, Bill had said, pointing to one photograph. He thought the rare Earth concentrations were the result of some kind of meteor impact millions of years ago. The crystalline structures were formed under extreme heat and pressure, but he could never prove it without professional excavation, and he couldn't risk bringing in outside experts. There was more, a topographic survey map from 1952. marked with hand-drawn annotations showing cave entrances and underground water flow patterns. One entrance was circled in red ink with a note: "Primary access concealed by rockfall, cleared 2001. "Do you know where this entrance is?" Cora had asked. Tom marked it on the modern property map. Bill had pulled out another document, spreading it on the desk. The entrance was on her land, about a mile east of the farmhouse, in an area of dense forest and limestone outcroppings. He said it was partially hidden by vegetation and rubble. You'd need to know what you were looking for. Cora had studied the maps, committing landmarks to memory. What about Vanguard? How much do they know? More than we'd like. They've had people surveying from adjacent properties, probably using ground-penetrating radar and other technology. They know something valuable is there. They just can't access it without owning your land. He'd paused. Miss Finch, these are dangerous people. They've spent years and considerable money trying to acquire this property. They won't stop just because ownership changed hands. I understand. Do you? His expression had been grave. Tom Hadley was found on paper. He had credit cards, bank accounts, a social security number. But he managed to disappear so completely that even the FBI couldn't locate him. He did that because he believed his life was in danger. What makes you think you'll fare any better? Because I'm not trying to disappear. I'm trying to bring everything into the light. She gathered all the documents, thanked Bill for his trust, and driven back to her property as afternoon shadows lengthened. The manila envelope sat on her passenger seat, heavy with secrets that were now hers to carry. Back at the farmhouse, she'd laid everything out on the table and floor, creating a complete picture of what Hadley had discovered. The geology was clear. A meteor impact millions of years ago had created unusual mineral concentrations and extensive underground cavern systems. The value was undeniable, millions of dollars in rare earth elements essential for modern technology. But there was something else in Hadley's notes, something he'd been reluctant to document clearly. In the margins of several surveys, he'd written questions. How deep does it go? What caused the geometric formations? Explain the electromagnetic readings. He'd clearly found something beyond simple geology, something that raised questions he couldn't answer. Cora had spent the rest of the afternoon planning her approach. Tomorrow, she'd locate the cave entrance using Hadley's maps and the 1952 survey. She'd mark her path, go slowly, document everything. If the chambers were as extensive as the surveys suggested, she'd need multiple trips to explore thoroughly. As evening fell, a vehicle came up her driveway. Cora had watched from the window, hand on the rifle she now kept close. But it was Faye Drummond, driving her old sedan and carrying another covered dish. Thought you might like some company, Faye had said when Cora opened the door. And I made too much stew. They'd eaten together at the small table, talking about inconsequential things, the weather turning colder, the difficulty of the access road, Faye's grown children who lived in other states. But eventually the conversation had turned more serious. I heard about your tires, Faye had said quietly. Small town word travels. That was meant as a warning, I figured. My husband, Dennis, he took money from Vanguard 15 years ago. They wanted information about Tom Hadley, about what he was doing on the property. Dennis worked for the county surveyor's office. He had access to records, maps, survey data. He gave them copies. She'd looked down at her hands, guilt evident. We needed the money. Our daughter was sick, medical bills were crushing us. But Dennis has regretted it every day since. Is he willing to talk about what he gave them? He's dying. Faye's voice had been steady but sad. Lung cancer, too far gone for treatment. But he's made his peace with it, and part of that peace means making amends where he can. If you want to know what Vanguard knows, he'll tell you. He's at home now on hospice care. Probably has a few weeks left. Cora had reached across the table and squeezed Faye's hand. I'd like to talk to him. When it's convenient. Tomorrow afternoon. He's clearest in the afternoons. They'd agreed, and after Faye left, Cora had sat alone in the gathering darkness, thinking about the chain of people this land had touched. Albert Marsh keeping a government secret. William Marsh burdened by inherited knowledge. Thomas Hadley driven into hiding. Dennis Drummond compromising his principles and living with regret. And now her, deciding what to do with all of it. The land had a way of demanding choices from people. You could walk away, sell cheap, and spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been. Or you could stand firm, face whatever came, and accept the consequences. Cora had spent 40 years taking the safe path, the path of least resistance, never staying long enough for consequences to catch up. She was done running. Whatever this land held, whatever dangers it attracted, she would see it through. Not out of bravery. She didn't feel particularly brave, but out of simple stubbornness and the deep-seated belief that some things were worth fighting for, even if you'd only just found them. Morning came cold enough that frost coated the grass. Cora had dressed in layers, gathered her new equipment, and set out with Hadley's maps and the 1952 survey. The cave entrance was supposed to be a mile east, in terrain she hadn't yet explored. The forest in that direction was older, denser. Massive pines blocked out much of the sky, and the ground was littered with fallen timber and moss-covered stones. She'd walked carefully, checking the GPS coordinates against Hadley's markings, adjusting her path when the terrain forced detours. After 40 minutes, she'd found the limestone outcropping the survey had indicated. It rose 20 feet, weathered and ancient, covered in places by thick vegetation. She'd circled it slowly, looking for any sign of an opening. On the eastern face, partially hidden by a fallen log and thick undergrowth, she'd found what she was looking for, a dark gap between rocks, barely visible unless you knew to look. Cora had cleared away branches and debris, revealing an opening large enough to crawl through. Cold air flowed from the gap, the breath of deep chambers below. She'd put on her helmet, switched on her headlamp, and tested the batteries. Everything worked. She'd tied one end of her rope to a sturdy pine tree, creating an anchor point, and fed the rope into the opening as insurance. The entrance passage was tight. She'd had to crawl on her belly for 15 feet before it opened up. But then the space expanded dramatically. Her headlamp revealed a chamber the size of a small house, limestone walls glistening with moisture, formations hanging from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls. She'd moved carefully, testing each foothold. The floor sloped downward, and in one corner a natural passage led deeper. Evidence of previous exploration was everywhere. Old rope fibers tied to rock spurs, the remains of a camping lantern, boot prints preserved in dried mud. Following Hadley's markings on her map, she descended into a second chamber, then a third. Each was larger than the last, connected by passages that required careful navigation. In the third chamber, she'd found Hadley's abandoned base camp, a small tent, folding chair, a plastic storage container with supplies. The tent was mildewed but intact. Inside the storage container, she'd found what she'd been hoping for, a geologist's sample bag. The bag contained dozens of rock specimens, each carefully labeled with coordinates and dates. Small tags indicated what Hadley had identified: neodymium-rich basalt, terbium oxide concentration, dysprosium trace, high grade. Each label also included an estimated value per ton of material. Cora had photographed every specimen, every label. She'd pulled out her phone, knowing there was no signal this deep, but storing the images for later upload. The specimens alone proved the deposit's value. With professional extraction and processing, the rare earth elements in these rocks could be worth millions. But it was the final specimen that caught her attention. It was different from the others, crystalline, geometric, almost artificial in its regularity. The label read, "Unknown formation, magnetic properties. Origin unclear." She'd held it up to her headlamp, watching light refract through its structure in unusual patterns. She'd bagged several samples, including the mysterious crystal, and made her way back to the surface. The climb out was harder than the descent, but she'd managed it without incident. By the time she emerged into daylight, her clothes were filthy and her muscles ached, but she felt triumphant. She had physical proof now, not just documents and theories. Back at the farmhouse, she'd cleaned up and spent an hour researching rare earth elements on her laptop. What she learned was sobering. These materials were essential for everything from smartphones to electric vehicles to military defense systems. Most of the world's supply came from China, making domestic sources strategically valuable. A deposit like the one on her property would attract interest far beyond simple corporate greed. That afternoon, she'd driven to Faye's house as arranged. Dennis Drummond was in a hospital bed set up in their living room, surrounded by medical equipment and photographs of his life. He was gaunt, his breathing labored, but his eyes were clear and sharp. "You're the one who bought Tom's place," he'd said as Cora sat beside his bed. His voice was rough but steady. "Faye tells me you're asking questions. I'm trying to understand what I'm dealing with." "Smart." He gestured to Faye, who brought a folder from a desk drawer. "I gave Vanguard copies of county survey records, property maps, and geological assessment data that Tom had filed with the county for permit applications. They paid me $20,000 for information that should have been confidential. I'm not proud of it. What did they do with that information? Used it to map the property remotely, probably with ground-penetrating radar from adjacent lands. They know the cave systems exist. They know about the mineral deposits. What they don't know, what Tom was smart enough never to document officially, is exactly where the richest concentrations are or how to access the deep chambers." Dennis had paused to catch his breath, and Faye had helped him with his oxygen. When he continued, his voice was quieter. "The man who paid me, Randall Kemp, he's not just a corporate lawyer. He's a fixer. Vanguard brings him in when they need problems solved quietly. He told me that one way or another, Vanguard would acquire that property. Said it was a matter of strategic national interest, that the government would eventually intervene on their behalf. I don't know if that was true or just intimidation. Did Tom know you'd sold him out?" "He figured it out eventually. Confronted me in 2015. I confessed everything, offered to return the money. He said it was too late for that, but he didn't hate me for it. Just told me to be careful, that people who dealt with Vanguard had a way of becoming disposable." Dennis had looked at Cora with intensity. "Miss Finch, I'm telling you this because I owe Tom Hadley an apology I can't deliver in person. If you're planning to fight Vanguard, you need to know they've been planning this acquisition for over 20 years. They have resources, connections, and patience, and they've never failed to get what they want." Cora had thanked him and left with the folder of documents he'd given Vanguard years ago. On the drive home, she'd felt the weight of accumulated knowledge pressing down. Everyone who'd touched this land had been changed by it, most of them diminished or damaged. That evening, sitting at her table with all the evidence spread before her, Hadley's journals, the assay reports, the sample specimens, Dennis's confession, she'd made several decisions. First, she'd create multiple copies of everything and store them in different locations. Second, she'd reach out to contacts who might help. Environmental lawyers, investigative journalists, academic geologists who could verify her findings. Third, she'd document everything she discovered from now on, creating a public record that couldn't be suppressed if something happened to her. She'd started with the easiest task, sending encrypted emails to 3 different journalists she'd found through online searches. Each email contained a brief outline of the situation and an offer to provide documentation in exchange for serious investigation. She didn't expect immediate responses, but planted seeds that might grow into protection. Then she'd called the only family she had left, her niece Stella in Portland. They weren't close. Cora had always been too transient for real relationships, but Stella was smart and loyal. "Aunt Cora," Stella had answered, surprised. "Is everything okay? I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen carefully without asking too many questions yet." She'd explained in broad terms. The property, the discovery, the corporate pressure, the danger she might be facing. Stella had wanted to come immediately, but Cora had refused. "I don't want you involved in this directly, but I'm sending you copies of documents. If something happens to me, if I disappear or die under suspicious circumstances, I need you to make sure these documents reach the authorities and the press. Can you do that?" Stella had agreed, her voice tight with worry. "Please be careful. I'm always careful." After the call, Cora had sat in the darkness of her farmhouse, listening to the mountain sounds. Tomorrow she'd return to the caves for more exploration. But tonight, she needed to acknowledge what she'd been avoiding. She was genuinely afraid. Not of the caves or the physical dangers, but of the larger forces arrayed against her. Vanguard Resources wasn't just a company. It was an entity with the power to make people disappear, to corrupt local officials, to exert pressure through channels she didn't fully understand. But fear, she'd learned over 62 years, was just information. It told you what the stakes were, what might be lost. It didn't have to dictate action. She'd been afraid before, afraid of hunger during lean times, afraid of winter without proper shelter, afraid of aging alone without savings or security. She'd survived all of it through stubbornness and refusal to quit. This was no different. She had something worth protecting now, something bigger than herself. That made the fear manageable, almost irrelevant. What mattered was moving forward with eyes open, understanding the risks, and accepting that some battles chose you rather than the other way around. 3 days later, Cora returned to the cave system with better lights and more confidence. She'd spent the intervening time studying Hadley's maps in detail, planning her route, and gathering additional supplies. The chambers she'd already explored were impressive, but according to Hadley's surveys, they were just the beginning. The deepest chambers remained unexplored in her trips so far. She'd descended through the familiar passages, past Hadley's base camp, and into territory she hadn't yet mapped. The passages grew narrower here, requiring careful navigation. In one tight squeeze, she'd had to remove her pack and push it ahead of her, crawling through on her belly. But then the passage opened into a chamber unlike anything she'd seen before. It was massive. Her headlamp couldn't find the far walls. The ceiling rose at least 50 feet, covered in mineral formations that glittered in her light. And along one wall, tucked into a natural alcove, she'd found something unexpected, a more recent encampment. This wasn't the abandoned base camp she'd found earlier. This site showed signs of recent use, a sleeping bag rated for current seasons, a battery-powered lantern that still held charge, and a small camping stove. More importantly, there was a heavy-duty plastic case, the kind used for protecting sensitive equipment. Cora had approached carefully, her instincts alert for any sign she wasn't alone. But the chamber was silent, except for the drip of water somewhere in the darkness. She'd opened the case with hands that trembled slightly. Inside was a sealed, waterproof container, and inside that, a letter and a USB drive. The letter was handwritten on lined paper, dated just 2 months ago, July 2025. It began, "To whoever finds this, if you're reading this letter, it means you bought my property and have been brave or curious enough to explore. My name is Thomas Hadley, and I'm writing to you from a small town in New Mexico where I've been living under an assumed name for the past 7 years." Cora had sat down on a flat rock, holding the letter close to her headlamp, reading with growing astonishment. "I didn't die, and I didn't simply disappear. I staged my disappearance deliberately after Vanguard Resources made it clear they would stop at nothing to acquire my property. The final straw was when they sabotaged my truck's brakes. I survived by luck, and I realized that being Thomas Hadley had become too dangerous. I'd been planning an exit strategy for months. I had cash hidden, documents prepared, contacts who could help me create a new identity. The night I disappeared, I left everything behind deliberately. My truck, my personal belongings, enough evidence to suggest an accident or voluntary disappearance, but nothing definitive. Then I walked off my property and never looked back. What I discovered on this land goes beyond simple geology. Yes, there are rare earth deposits worth approximately $11 million in conservative estimates. But the real value and the real danger comes from something I could never fully document or understand. The crystalline formations in the deepest chambers exhibit properties that defy conventional geological explanation. They're not just valuable minerals. There's something unprecedented. I sent samples to 3 different laboratories under false names. All 3 came back with similar findings. The crystals contain rare earth elements in concentrations and combinations that shouldn't exist naturally on Earth's surface. The best explanation, and this is speculation, is that they're the result of a meteor impact millions of years ago, but not from ordinary space rock. The crystalline structures suggest formation under conditions of extreme heat, pressure, and possibly electromagnetic forces that I can't adequately explain. Vanguard Resources knows about the rare earth deposits. That's public geology, documented in county records. What they don't know, what I never documented officially, is the full extent of the deeper chambers and what lies within them. The USB drive I've included contains complete geological surveys, laboratory reports, and most importantly, evidence of Vanguard's illegal activities. I've documented years of harassment, intimidation, attempted bribery, and threats. I have recordings, emails, photographs, and testimony from people they've corrupted or threatened. This evidence could shut down their operations and lead to criminal charges against several executives, including their chief acquisition officer, Rendell Kemp. I've been waiting for the right moment to expose all of this, but that moment never came. I've grown comfortable in my new life, and I've grown cautious. The truth is, I'm afraid of what Vanguard might do if I surface. So I'm placing this burden on you, whoever you are. You have several options. The easiest is to sell the property cheaply to Vanguard and walk away with enough money to be comfortable. They'll pay you well for your silence, and you'll avoid the trouble I faced. Or you can fight. Use the evidence I've provided to expose them, protect the land, and potentially benefit from its resources in a controlled, legal manner. If you choose to fight, contact the people listed in the encrypted files on this USB drive. There's an environmental attorney in Seattle who specializes in mineral rights cases, an investigative journalist who's been tracking Vanguard for years, and a former USGS geologist who can verify my findings. Together, they can help you navigate this mess. One final piece of information that may shock you. I chose you specifically. When I learned the county was seizing my property for back taxes and planning to auction it, I had a friend in the assessor's office arrange for a specific type of listing, $1 as is, minimum publicity. Then I had another friend monitor who showed interest. When your name came up and I researched your background, I saw someone with the qualities I hoped for: independence, resilience, honesty, and most importantly, someone who had nothing to lose and everything to gain. I'm sorry for placing this burden on you without your knowledge or consent, but I genuinely believe you're capable of handling what I couldn't. The land deserves someone who will protect it, not exploit it carelessly. And the truth about Vanguard's activities deserves to come to light. If you decide to contact me, there's an encrypted email address in the USB files. I'll respond, though it may take time. If you decide to sell and walk away, I understand completely. This was never your fight, and you have no obligation to carry my torch. Whatever you decide, know that you were not chosen randomly. You were chosen carefully, with hope and faith that you would do what's right. Good luck, and I'm sorry I couldn't be braver 7 years ago. Thomas Hadley Cora had read the letter twice, her emotions cycling through shock, anger, and grudging respect. Hadley had manipulated her, but with purpose. He'd put her in danger, but also given her tools to fight back. Most importantly, he'd been honest about his own limitations and fears. The USB drive would contain the evidence he'd promised. She'd verify that when she had computer access. But the revelation that changed everything was simple. This wasn't random. She hadn't stumbled into this situation through luck or chance. She'd been selected, evaluated, and deliberately placed here by someone who decided she was capable of finishing what he'd started. It should have made her angry. And part of her was. But another part, the part shaped by 40 years of working land and reading people, understood. Hadley had seen in her what she'd been trying to see in herself, someone who could stand firm when standing firm mattered. She'd packed up the letter and USB drive, taking one last look around the massive chamber. Somewhere in this darkness, were the crystalline formations Hadley had described, the mysterious geological anomalies worth more than anyone had yet calculated. Tomorrow, she'd return with better equipment and document everything. Tonight, she needed to get back to her farmhouse, secure these documents, and decide what came next. The climb out of the cave seemed faster, fueled by adrenaline and purpose. By the time she emerged into late afternoon sunlight, her mind was already working through options and strategies. She wasn't a pawn in someone else's game. She was a player who just learned the actual rules. Hadley had given her weapons, evidence, contacts, and the truth about what she was facing. Now she needed to decide how to use them. The easy path, selling to Vanguard and walking away wealthy, held no appeal. She'd spent 40 years taking easy paths, and they'd led her to 62 years old with nothing but a rucksack of possessions. This land, these secrets, this fight, they were hers now. Not because she'd sought them, but because they'd found her. Or rather, because someone had decided she was the right person to find them. She could honor that faith or betray it. The choice was simple, even if the consequences weren't. Cora spent that night at her kitchen table with her laptop, the USB drive plugged in, working through Hadley's files by lamplight. The drive was encrypted, but he'd included the password in his letter. Inside were hundreds of documents, photographs, audio recordings, and video files. Years of accumulated evidence, organized into neat folders. The geological surveys were professional and comprehensive. Hadley had documented every chamber, every passage, every mineral concentration with scientific precision. His estimates of the rare earth deposits were conservative but substantial. $11 million was based on current market prices and accessible deposits only. If the deeper formations proved equally rich, the value could reach $15 to $18 million. But the evidence against Vanguard Resources was what held her attention. Hadley had recorded phone conversations where Randall Kemp made thinly veiled threats. He'd photographed suspicious vehicles surveilling his property. He had emails showing bribes paid to county officials and attempts to manipulate zoning regulations. Most damning were bank records showing payments from Vanguard shell companies to people like Dennis Drummond, a paper trail of corruption spanning years. There was also a list of contacts, as promised. An environmental attorney named Sarah Brennan in Seattle, who specialized in mineral rights disputes. An investigative journalist named Marcus Webb, who'd written extensively about corporate malfeasance in natural resource extraction. A retired USGS geologist named Dr. Patricia Oakes, who could verify Hadley's findings. Cora had stared at those names for a long time, understanding that contacting them meant committing fully to this fight. There would be no going back to anonymity or safety. But she'd already made her decision in the cave when she'd read Hadley's letter. She'd composed careful emails to all three contacts, using the encrypted communication method Hadley had set up. She explained who she was, how she'd acquired the property, what she'd discovered, and what she needed. To Sarah Brennan, legal protection and advice. To Marcus Webb, investigation and public exposure. To Dr. Oakes, scientific verification and credibility. She'd sent the emails at 2 in the morning and crawled into bed with the USB drive hidden in her rucksack. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by the sounds of the mountain night and her own restless thoughts. Morning brought responses. All three contacts had replied within hours, their messages urgent and interested. Sarah Brennan offered an immediate phone consultation. Marcus Webb wanted to visit the property within the week. Dr. Oakes requested copies of the geological data and promised rapid analysis. But the morning also brought something else. Cora had been making coffee when she noticed the footprints. Fresh tracks in the frost-covered grass outside her window, leading from the tree line to her farmhouse and back. Someone had been watching during the night. Someone had come close enough to look through her windows. She'd followed the tracks to where they disappeared into the forest, finding cigarette butts and scuffed earth where someone had stood for extended periods. The surveillance had escalated. They weren't just watching from a distance anymore. They were getting bold, Cora had returned to the farmhouse and immediately made copies of everything on the USB drive, storing them on separate thumb drives she'd bought in Boise. One she mailed to Stella with explicit instructions. One she left with Faye Drummond, who'd stopped by mid-morning with genuine concern etched on her face. "Dennis died last night," Faye had said quietly, peaceful in his sleep. "But before he went, he made me promise to look out for you. Said you were walking the same dangerous path Tom Hadley walked." Cora had embraced her, feeling the weight of Dennis's final act of conscience. "I'm sorry for your loss. Don't be. He was ready and he was at peace." Faye had gripped Cora's shoulders. "But you need to understand something. Vanguard knows you're not just a simple buyer. They've been watching you explore, watching you research. They know you're onto something. It's only a matter of time before they make a direct move. Let them come." That's brave talk, but Cora, these people don't play fair. Neither do I when it matters. After Faye left, Cora had spent the afternoon preparing. She'd contacted Sheriff's Office formally, filing reports about the surveillance and trespassing, knowing it would create a paper trail, even if they did nothing. She'd photographed everything. The footprints, the cigarette butts, the tire tracks where vehicles had parked on the Forest Service road. Then she'd called Marcus Webb directly. He'd answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the intensity of someone perpetually chasing stories. "Miss Finch, I've been hoping someone would contact me about that property. I've been tracking Vanguard's activities in Idaho for 3 years, but I've never had access to hard evidence. I have evidence. Recordings, documents, bank records showing bribery and corruption. But I need your help bringing it public in a way that protects me and ensures the story doesn't get buried. When can I come out there?" 3 days. "I need time to document the cave system fully first. Bring professional camera equipment if you can. I want everything recorded in high definition." They'd agreed on a date and time, discussing logistics and safety protocols. Marcus would arrive with a documentary filmmaker he trusted, and they'd spend 2 days gathering footage and interviews. The story would run simultaneously in print and video, making it harder to suppress. Next, she'd spoken with Sarah Brennan, the environmental attorney. Sarah had been equally eager, but more cautious. "What you're describing is valuable land with documented corporate harassment. That's actionable. But Miss Finch, I need to be honest. Taking on a company like Vanguard requires resources. They'll bury us in legal motions, appeals, and delays. Do you have funds for a sustained legal battle?" "I have enough. And I have evidence that might shorten the battle considerably. Send me copies of everything. I'll start building a case. We need to establish your clear ownership, document all harassment, and file protective orders before they try anything more aggressive. I can have preliminary paperwork ready in 48 hours. The call with Dr. Oakes had been the most technical. She'd reviewed the geological data Cora sent and responded with scientific excitement barely, contained by professional restraint. "If these surveys are accurate, and I have no reason to doubt Thomas Hadley's work, you're sitting on one of the most significant rare earth deposits discovered in the continental United States in the past 30 years. The strategic implications alone are enormous. Every major tech company and defense contractor in the country would have interest in securing access to this supply." "What about the crystalline formations Hadley mentioned? The ones he couldn't explain?" Dr. Oakes had paused. "I'd need to see them in person to comment definitively, but based on his descriptions and the laboratory analysis, they sound like impactite, rock formed by meteor impact under extreme conditions. If they contain the rare Earth concentrations he documented, formed through extraterrestrial processes, that's genuinely unprecedented. We're talking about potential scientific papers, museum exhibits, international attention, which means even more pressure on me to give up the land." "Exactly. Miss Finch, you need protection, scientific, legal, and possibly physical. Would you be willing to have a team come document everything under controlled conditions? With proper credentials and public observation, it becomes much harder for private interests to suppress the findings." Cora had agreed, setting up a timeline. 3 days for her final solo exploration and documentation, then Marcus Webb's visit. followed by a scientific team led by Dr. Oakes. Each step would increase public knowledge and decrease Vanguard's ability to act with impunity. But between those phone calls and the growing sense of momentum, something else happened. A vehicle came up her driveway late that afternoon, a sleek black SUV with tinted windows. Cora had watched from her window, rifle within reach, as a man in an expensive suit climbed out. He was tall, probably 50, with silver hair and the kind of confidence that came from rarely being told no. He'd knocked on her door politely, and when Cora answered with the rifle visible behind her, he'd simply smiled. "Miss Finch? I'm Brandel Kemp, representing Vanguard Resource Solutions. I was hoping we could have a conversation." "About what?" "About your property, about options that might benefit us both. May I come in?" "I promise this will be worth your time." Against her better judgment, or perhaps because she wanted to see what he'd offer, Cora had let him in. He'd sat at her table declining coffee and looked around the modest farmhouse with undisguised assessment. "You've done some exploring," he'd said, noting the maps and documents she hadn't fully hidden. "Found interesting things, I imagine." Thomas Hadley was thorough in his research before his unfortunate disappearance. "What do you want, Mr. Kemp?" "To make you a straightforward offer. $250,000, cash, immediate closing. You walk away with enough money to buy a nice place anywhere you want, and we acquire a property that has strategic interest to our operations. Everyone wins, and if I decline..." His smile had hardened slightly. "Miss Finch, I've been doing this work for 20 years. I've seen how these situations develop. You're a practical woman, I can see that. You've worked hard your whole life, probably never had much financial security. This property is remote, demanding, and frankly more trouble than it's worth for someone in your position. Take the money. Make your life easier. The answer is no. Be certain before you refuse. Our offer is generous now, but it won't remain generous if complications arise. Property disputes can be lengthy and expensive. Environmental assessments can take years. Title challenges can emerge. Why put yourself through that stress when you could be comfortable instead?" Cora had stood, opening the door. "I think we're done here." Kemp had risen slowly, his expression shifting to something colder. "I've tried being reasonable. I've made fair offers. But understand this. Vanguard has invested considerable resources in securing access to this land. We're not going away because one stubborn woman thinks she can stand against institutional interests. You will sell, Miss Finch. The only question is whether you do it now, on favorable terms, or later, after we've exhausted every legal avenue, and your life has become significantly more difficult. Get off my property." He'd left without further words, but his SUV had lingered at the end of her driveway for 20 minutes before finally disappearing down the mountain road. Cora had watched until the dust settled, understanding that the pretense of civility was over. Vanguard knew she wasn't just a simple buyer who'd stumbled into ownership. They knew she was investigating, documenting, and preparing to fight. That night, Cora had done something she hadn't done in years. She'd prayed. Not to any specific deity. She'd never been particularly religious, but to the land itself, to whatever spirits or forces governed the mountains. She'd asked for strength, wisdom, and protection. And then she'd loaded her rifle, set it beside her bed, and slept with the kind of determined exhaustion that comes from knowing a storm is approaching, and there's nothing to do but weather it. Tomorrow, she'd return to the caves one final time, document everything she'd found, and bring back samples that Dr. Oakes could analyze. Then Marcus Webb would arrive, and the process of making everything public would begin. Once the story broke, once the evidence was distributed and verified, Vanguard's power to act against her would diminish. Public attention was protection. Transparency was armor. She just had to survive long enough to reach that point. Dawn arrived cold and clear. The kind of mountain morning that made everything feel sharp and immediate. Cora had been awake since before sunrise, preparing for what she knew would be her final solo exploration of the caves. Marcus Webb would arrive tomorrow with his camera crew, and after that, The site would never again be private or quiet. She'd packed carefully, professional camera equipment she'd rented in Boise, sample collection bags, measuring tools, and the GPS unit that would create precise coordinates for every significant finding. This time she wanted documentation that would stand up to scientific scrutiny. Marcus Webb had called her just after breakfast. "Miss Finch, I'm bringing a professional surveyor with me tomorrow, a man named Marcus Webb, no relation. He's experienced with cave systems and has the equipment to create detailed 3D maps of the chambers. With your permission, we'd like to document everything thoroughly." She'd agreed immediately, relieved to have expert help. But that also meant today was her last chance to experience the caves on her own terms, before they became public knowledge and scientific curiosity. The hike to the cave entrance felt different this time. She was no longer exploring unknown territory. She was saying goodbye to a secret she'd held for too brief a time. The forest was quiet, just birdsong and the whisper of wind through pine branches. She'd entered the caves with practiced confidence, descending through familiar passages to Hadley's base camp and beyond. Her destination was the massive chamber where she'd found Hadley's letter, and more importantly, the deeper passages that led to the crystalline formations he'd described, but she hadn't yet fully explored. The passages beyond the large chamber were narrower, requiring careful navigation. She'd marked her route with glow sticks, ensuring she could find her way back. After 20 minutes of steady descent, the passage opened into something extraordinary. The chamber was smaller than the one above, but filled with formations unlike anything she'd seen. Crystalline structures rose from the floor and hung from the ceiling. Not stalactites or stalagmites, but geometric shapes that caught her headlamp light and refracted it in prismatic patterns. The formations were regular, almost architectural, as if someone had deliberately arranged them. Cora had approached slowly, camera recording everything. The crystals were embedded in the limestone walls, concentrations of minerals that seemed to glow with internal light. She'd touched one carefully. It was cool and smooth, the surface almost glassy. When she tapped it with her knuckle, it produced a clear, bell-like tone that resonated through the chamber. She'd spent an hour documenting everything, photographs from multiple angles, video walkthroughs, measurements of the formations, GPS coordinates for each significant structure. She'd collected samples carefully, breaking off small pieces and sealing them in labeled bags. Dr. Oakes would analyze these and confirm what Hadley had suspected. These weren't ordinary geological formations. As she worked, she'd felt a strange sense of connection to the place. These chambers had existed in darkness for millions of years, formed by forces beyond human understanding. Hadley had found them and recognized their significance. Now she was continuing that work, bringing them toward the light of public knowledge. She'd been preparing to leave, samples packed and documentation complete, when she'd heard something that made her freeze. Voices, distant but clear, echoing through the passages. Someone else was in the cave system. Cora had switched off her headlamp immediately, relying on ambient light from her glow stick markers. She'd moved quietly back toward the passage entrance, listening carefully. 3 men, maybe 4, their conversation carried by the acoustics of the tunnels. Somewhere down here. The old man's notes mentioned this chamber specifically. How much further? We've been walking for 30 minutes. Keep moving. We need samples and photographs before the property gets locked down legally. Once that attorney files protective orders, we won't have another chance. Cora's pulse had quickened. Vanguard had sent people into her caves, trespassing, stealing, trying to document what she'd kept private. They knew she was building a case, and they were racing to establish their own evidence. She'd eased back into the crystal chamber, looking for alternative exits. Hadley's maps had shown multiple passages, but she hadn't explored them all. In the far corner, behind the largest crystalline formation, she'd found what she was looking for, a narrow opening that appeared to descend further. She'd squeezed through carefully. Pack held ahead of her, and found herself in a natural chimney, a vertical passage with enough handholds to climb down. Below, she could see another chamber, smaller, but with what looked like a horizontal passage leading away. Behind her, the voices grew louder. Jesus, look at these formations. Get the camera on everything. This proves the deposit's value. Cora had descended the chimney quickly but carefully, her climbing experience from years of farm work serving her well. She dropped the last 6 feet and landed in a crouch, immediately moving into the horizontal passage. The passage was tight. She'd had to crawl in places, but it continued steadily. And most importantly, it was taking her away from the intruders. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably 15 minutes, she'd seen light ahead. Natural light. The passage emerged on the eastern face of a limestone cliff she'd noticed during her property surveys, but never approached from this angle. It was concealed by vegetation and would be nearly impossible to spot unless you knew exactly where to look. A natural hidden exit that Hadley had probably discovered and used as an escape route. She'd climbed down the cliff face carefully, using roots and rock ledges, and found herself about half a mile from her farmhouse, but approaching from a different direction than usual. The forest provided cover as she circled back toward home. Inside the farmhouse, she'd immediately called Marcus Webb. "We have a problem. Vanguard sent people into the caves. They're documenting everything right now, probably trying to establish prior claim or gather evidence they can use against us." Marcus had been silent for a moment, then, "That's actually good news for us. They're trespassing on private property and stealing geological samples. If we can prove they're down there, that's evidence of corporate malfeasance." "Do you have security cameras?" "No, but I know where their vehicle must be parked. The only access point is near the cave entrance. Get photographs if you can, safely. License plates, faces, anything identifiable. I'm leaving Seattle now. I'll be there by tonight instead of tomorrow. We need to document this while it's happening." Cora had grabbed her camera and headed back into the forest, approaching the cave entrance from a concealed position. Sure enough, 2 vehicles were parked on her property near the access trail, a dark blue pickup and a grey SUV. She'd photographed them from multiple angles, getting clear shots of license plates and corporate logos on equipment visible through windows. While she waited, the men had emerged from the caves, 3 of them, carrying bags and professional photography equipment. She'd recorded video of them loading their vehicles and leaving, capturing clear facial images and vehicle identifications. As soon as they disappeared down the mountain road, she'd returned to the farmhouse and sent everything to Marcus Webb, Sarah Brennan, and Dr. Oakes. The evidence of trespassing was now documented and distributed. Vanguard's aggressive move had backfired. They'd provided her with proof of illegal activity. That evening, as sunset painted the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Cora had sat on her porch with a cup of coffee, feeling the weight of what was coming. Tomorrow, Marcus would arrive with his team. The documentation would begin in earnest. The story would start taking shape, a story about corporate greed, illegal intimidation, and one woman's refusal to be pushed off land that was rightfully hers. She'd spent 40 years moving through other people's spaces, never claiming anything as her own. But this land, these caves, this fight, they were hers now. And she'd defend them with everything she had. Marcus Webb arrived just after dark, driving a rental SUV loaded with camera equipment and accompanied by his surveyor colleague and a documentary filmmaker named Rachel Chen. They'd been professional and urgent, understanding that timing mattered. "We document everything tonight and tomorrow," Marcus had explained as they unloaded equipment. "Video interviews with you, footage of the trespassing evidence, establishment shots of the property. Then tomorrow at dawn, we go into the caves with proper lighting and equipment. By tomorrow evening, I'll have enough material for both a written exposé and a short documentary. We release simultaneously across multiple platforms, makes it harder to suppress." They'd worked through the night. Cora had given an on-camera interview detailing everything, how she'd acquired the property, what she'd discovered, the harassment she'd faced, and the evidence of Vanguard's illegal activities. Rachel had filmed B-roll of the property, the barn where she'd found Hadley's compass, and the farmhouse interior that told the story of a working woman making a stand. Dawn had found them at the cave entrance. Marcus and his surveyor loaded with professional equipment, while Rachel operated a high-end camera system. Cora had led them through the passages she now knew well, pointing out features and explaining what Hadley's surveys had documented. In the crystal chamber, Marcus's surveyor, a quiet man named David Park, had set up laser scanning equipment that created detailed 3D models of the space. Rachel had filmed everything while Marcus took photographs and measurements. They'd collected samples following Dr. Oakes's protocols and documented the geometric formations that defied conventional explanation. "This is extraordinary," David had said, studying the crystals through a specialized lens. "I've surveyed caves across 3 continents, and I've never seen natural formations quite like these. The regularity, the composition, it's remarkable." They'd spent 4 hours underground, documenting every significant chamber and passage. By the time they'd emerged, all 3 visitors had been transformed by what they'd seen, the excitement of journalists and scientists encountering something genuinely unprecedented. Back at the farmhouse, while Marcus and Rachel began processing footage, Cora had received a call from Sarah Brennan. "I'm filing protective orders this afternoon," Sarah had said. "Based on the trespassing evidence you provided, I can establish immediate grounds for legal action. More importantly, I'm filing a formal complaint with state and federal authorities regarding Vanguard's activities. The evidence Thomas Hadley collected is extensive enough to warrant criminal investigation. How long before they respond? They'll know about the filings within hours. Expect them to try negotiation first, better settlement terms, promises of legal protection. When that fails, they'll likely escalate to hardball tactics. But you've done something smart. You've made this public before they could isolate you. That's your best protection." Late that afternoon, as Marcus was editing his initial story, 3 vehicles had come up the driveway. 2 Sheriff's Department SUVs and Randall Kemp's black sedan. Cora had watched them approach with Marcus and Rachel standing beside her. Cameras ready. Sheriff Tom Bradley had climbed out first, a man in his 50s who looked uncomfortable with whatever he'd been sent to do. Kemp had emerged from his vehicle with 2 other men in suits, his expression hard. "Miss Finch," the sheriff had said, "we've received complaints of trespassing and harassment. Need to ask you some questions." "Complaints from whom?" Kemp had stepped forward. "From Vanguard Resource Solutions. Your cameras were on our property yesterday, photographing our employees. That's unlawful surveillance and harassment." Marcus had raised his own camera, filming the exchange. "I'm Marcus Webb, investigative journalist. For the record, are you claiming Vanguard employees were on Miss Finch's property yesterday?" Kemp's expression had flickered with recognition and annoyance. "We were conducting legitimate survey work on adjacent properties with proper permissions. The photographs clearly show your vehicles and personnel on Miss Finch's land, near a cave entrance that's entirely within her property boundaries. That's trespassing. Moreover, I have documentation of years of harassment, intimidation, and illegal activities by Vanguard targeting multiple property owners. Those documents have been filed with state and federal authorities as of this afternoon." The sheriff had looked between them, clearly reassessing the situation. "Mr. Kemp, do you have documentation of permission to access Miss Finch's property?" "This is a misunderstanding. Do you have written permission?" The sheriff had pressed. Kemp's jaw had tightened. "We were under the impression certain areas were part of Federal Forest Service land. My property boundaries are clearly established in county records," Cora had said calmly. "And you've been aware of those boundaries since you first approached Thomas Hadley about purchasing this land 15 years ago. This isn't confusion. It's deliberate trespass." Rachel had continued filming as the sheriff had pulled Kemp aside for a private conversation. Marcus had used the opportunity to brief the deputies on the evidence they'd gathered, showing photographs and explaining the context of corporate harassment. When Sheriff Bradley had returned, his demeanor had changed. "Miss Finch, I'm going to need copies of your trespassing evidence. And Mr. Kemp, you'll need to come to my office tomorrow to make a formal statement. From what I'm seeing here, there are serious questions that need answers." Kemp had looked at Cora with barely contained anger. This isn't over. You're making a serious mistake. No, Cora had said quietly. The mistake was thinking you could intimidate me the way you intimidated Thomas Hadley. But I'm not alone, and I'm not hiding. Everything you've done is documented. Everything you've tried is now public record. You wanted this property badly enough to break the law. Now you'll face the consequences. Kemp had left without further words, his vehicles kicking up dust as they sped down the mountain road. The sheriff had stayed longer, taking statements and collecting evidence, his attitude shifting from skepticism to genuine concern as the full scope of the situation became clear. After everyone had finally left, Cora, Marcus, and Rachel had sat on the farmhouse porch, watching the sun set over the mountains. Marcus had been working on his laptop, putting finishing touches on the story. "This goes live in 2 hours," he'd said. "Print version on the newspaper's website. Video documentary on our media platforms. I've already gotten interest from national outlets who want to pick it up. By tomorrow morning, this will be everywhere." Cora had nodded, feeling a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. What happens next? Investigation, probably federal given the evidence of interstate corporate fraud. Media attention, scientific interest in the geological findings. And you become famous, at least for a while. People will want to interview you, tour the property, study the caves. Your quiet mountain life is about to get complicated. Better complicated than threatened, Rachel had smiled. For what it's worth, you're incredibly brave. Most people would have taken the money and walked away. I spent 40 years walking away from things. I'm too old to keep running. Cora had looked out at her land, at the mountains rising in the distance. Besides, some things are worth standing for. Even if you only just found them. The story had gone live at 8 p.m. Within an hour, Cora's phone had been ringing with media requests. By morning, the story had been picked up by major news outlets across the country. By afternoon, Vanguard Resources had issued a statement denying all allegations and promising full cooperation with any investigation. Their stock price had dropped 6%. Thomas Hadley's fight had finally found its voice. And Cora Finch, at 62, had discovered that the thing she'd been searching for her whole life wasn't a place. It was the courage to stop running and claim one. 3 weeks after Marcus Webb's story broke, Cora stood on her porch, watching a team of scientists from the U.S. Geological Survey set up equipment near the cave entrance. Dr. Patricia Oakes had arrived 2 days earlier with credentials, funding, and institutional backing to conduct a thorough survey of the site. The media attention had forced Vanguard to back away, and federal interest in the rare earth deposits had provided protection Cora couldn't have bought. The investigation into Vanguard's activities was moving forward. Brendan Kemp had been placed on administrative leave pending criminal charges. Documents Hadley had collected were being used to build cases against multiple executives. Several county officials, including the deputy who'd questioned Cora, were under review for accepting bribes, but the real transformation had been in the property's status. Sarah Brennan had helped Cora navigate a complex series of negotiations that honored both the land's value and its ecological significance. Rather than simple extraction rights, they'd structured something more innovative, a conservation easement that protected the majority of the land while allowing limited, sustainable mineral rights. The arrangement provided Cora with immediate financial stability, roughly $3 million through a combination of conservation payments, sustainable extraction licenses to an ethical mining company, and compensation from various settlement agreements. More importantly, it ensured the land would remain largely untouched, preserved for scientific study and natural beauty. Thomas Hadley had emerged from hiding 2 weeks ago, arriving at the property in a rented car with 7 years of beard growth and a tentative smile. Cora had been sitting on her porch when he'd driven up, and for a long moment they'd simply looked at each other, two people who'd never met but were connected by the burden of this land. "You did it," he'd said finally. "You finished what I couldn't. You gave me the tools. And you chose well, even if you had no right to choose for me. They talked for hours that first day, walking the property together, Hadley sharing stories of his 20 years here, and Cora explaining how she'd navigated the challenges he'd fled from. There was no romance in their connection. Both were too old and too set in their solitary ways. But there was friendship, the kind forged by shared purpose and mutual respect. Faye Drummond had become a regular visitor, no longer burdened by her husband's regrets. She'd brought casseroles and company, slowly building the kind of neighborly friendship Cora had never allowed herself to develop. Bill Marsh had stopped by several times, pleased to see the land secrets finally serving a purpose beyond silence. The property had been visited by everyone, from scientists to documentary filmmakers, to tourists curious about the woman who took on corporate America. Cora had been interviewed by national news programs, featured in magazines, and invited to speak at environmental conferences. She declined most invitations, preferring to stay on her land and manage the controlled access to the caves. Today, Dr. Oakes had confirmed what Hadley suspected. The crystalline formations were indeed impactites, rocks formed by meteor impact under conditions that created unprecedented mineral concentrations. The scientific papers would take months to publish, but preliminary findings suggested the site was of genuine geological significance, worthy of protection and study. Stella had visited from Portland, bringing her family and staying for a week in the farmhouse that Cora had slowly been improving. They'd hiked the property together, and Stella's children had explored with the wonder of young people encountering wilderness. Watching them, Cora had felt something unexpected, the sense of legacy. This land would outlive her, protected by legal agreements and scientific interest. But her role in preserving it would be remembered. The financial security had allowed Cora to make improvements she'd only dreamed about. A new roof on the barn, repairs to the farmhouse, a small cabin built for guests, and most importantly, proper conservation infrastructure, marked trails, protective barriers around the cave entrances, and monitoring equipment to ensure the site's preservation. But the money mattered less than what it represented, the ability to stay. She'd spent 40 years moving because staying was never an option. Now it was not just an option, but a commitment, and that changed everything. One afternoon in late October, nearly 2 months after buying the property for $1, Cora had sat on her porch with Thomas Hadley, watching the sun set over mountains that were beginning to show their first dusting of winter snow. "Do you regret it?" Hadley had asked. "Taking this on? Your life would be simpler if you'd sold to Vanguard and walked away." Cora had considered the question carefully. She'd been threatened, surveilled, and thrust into a public spotlight she'd never sought. She'd spent her savings on legal fees and equipment. She'd put herself in danger and made powerful enemies. By any practical measure, Cora had considered the question carefully. She'd been threatened, surveilled, and thrust into a public spotlight she'd never sought. She'd spent her savings on legal fees and equipment. She'd put herself in danger and made powerful enemies. By any practical measure, she'd made her life harder. "No," she'd said finally. "I spent 40 years making my life simpler. Simple isn't the same as meaningful." They'd sat in comfortable silence, two people who understood that some burdens were privileges, and some fights were worth the cost. The rucksack that had once contained everything Cora owned now sat in a corner of her bedroom, mostly empty. She'd unpacked it weeks ago, spreading her few possessions throughout the farmhouse with the understanding that she wouldn't need to pack them again. Her grandfather's books were on a shelf. Her work clothes hung in a closet. Her life had expanded to fill the space available, and the space was hers. On clear nights, she'd walk to the limestone outcropping where she'd first found Hadley's journal, sitting in the darkness and listening to the mountain sounds. The land had secrets still, chambers unexplored, formations undocumented, and she'd spend the rest of her years understanding them. But the dangerous secrets, the ones that had haunted 3 generations of owners, were finally exposed to light. What remained was simply the work of stewardship, and Cora had always been good at work. The conservation easement agreement sat framed on her wall, a document that represented more than legal protection. It was proof that you could stand against powerful interests and win, not through wealth or connections, but through stubbornness, documentation, and the willingness to make your fight public. It was proof that finding home at 62 was possible, that starting over was never too late, and that the thing you'd been searching for your whole life might be waiting in the most unexpected place. Cora had received a letter last week from Thomas Hadley's encrypted email, sent from wherever he'd chosen to settle permanently. "You gave me something I'd lost," he'd written. "The belief that truth matters and courage wins. Thank you for being braver than I was." The land chose well. She'd read that letter several times, touched by the sentiment, but disagreeing with the premise. She hadn't been braver than Hadley. She just had less to lose and nothing to run from. Sometimes courage wasn't about fearlessness. It was about having nowhere else to go and deciding that was exactly where you belonged. As November approached and the first real snowfall dusted the mountains, Cora had sat at her kitchen table making plans for winter. Firewood needed splitting. The farmhouse needed better insulation. Supplies needed stockpiling before the access road became difficult. These were the practical concerns of someone building a life, not passing through one. Faye had invited her for Thanksgiving dinner, introducing her as our neighbor who took on corporate America and won. The small gathering of locals had treated her with a mixture of respect and curiosity, but mostly they'd treated her as one of their own, someone who'd chosen this difficult, beautiful place and committed to staying. On her way home that evening, driving up the mountain road in the darkness, Cora had thought about the journey that brought her here. All those years of moving, of never claiming anything, of living light enough to disappear without trace. She'd thought it was freedom, that ability to walk away from anything. But it had been fear dressed up as independence, the fear of wanting something badly enough that losing it would break you. This land, this farmhouse, this community, she wanted them badly. Losing them would hurt, and that was okay. Better to hurt from loss than never to have claimed anything worth losing. Better to put down roots, even if storms might come. Better to be somewhere fully than nowhere completely. The mountains rose dark against the star-filled sky as she pulled into her driveway. The farmhouse lights were on. She'd left them burning. A small declaration that someone lived here, that this place was home. The barn stood solid against the night, its new roof gleaming faintly in moonlight. The land stretched away in all directions, protected and preserved, holding secrets that would take a lifetime to fully understand. Cora climbed out of her truck and stood for a moment, breathing in the cold mountain air. Somewhere in the forest an owl called. Somewhere deep below, in chambers she'd walked and documented, ancient crystals caught and held the darkness, waiting for light that would come with the next day's exploration. She'd bought this farm for $1 and discovered something worth 11 million. But the real treasure wasn't in the rocks or the rare earth deposits. It was simpler and more profound. She'd found a place that needed her as much as she needed it. She'd found work that mattered and friends who cared. She'd found the courage to stop running and the peace that came from finally standing still. At 62, Cora Finch had come home. Not to the place she'd started, but to the place she'd been traveling toward her whole life without knowing it. And standing there in the darkness with her farmhouse waiting and her mountains watching, she understood that the journey had been worth every difficult mile. Some treasures take a lifetime to find. Some are buried just beneath the surface, waiting for the right person to dig them up. And some, the most valuable ones, aren't treasures at all. They're simply the place where you finally stop searching and start living.